Welcome to the Filmmaker's Playbook. My name is Jason Branagan, and this is a podcast all about filmmaking. On today's show, I talk to producer Louise Say. Louise has 25 years' experience across high-end drama and landmark documentaries. Some of Louise's credits include iconic BBC series like Shetland, Dracula and Les Miserables. Other credits include Air Ambulance ER, How the Universe Works and Titanic, Birth of a Legend. In our conversation, we discuss Louise's career in the Royal Navy, moving from the military to theatre and television, the importance of clear communication in leadership roles, building trust with collaborators, producing Shetland, and much, much more. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you for listening. Louise Say, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
How are you?
I'm really good. Really good.
I'm glad to hear it. Before we get into your incredible body of television work, I would love first to talk to you about your career in the Royal Navy. I was hoping you might be able to tell me about what drew you to the Navy initially.
I think the Navy was appealing for a number of different reasons. I wanted to do something that mattered with my life, I suppose. And I was keen to fulfill something within me that drew me to duty, to service. And at the same time, I felt I needed to grow up a bit, if I'm honest. And I think the Navy gives you that training and the tools to do that. And that, combined with the fact that my parents were in the Navy, although they'd both left by the time I was born, there was that culture within the Say family. And they very much encouraged me to go in that direction. I felt that they knew that it was a good career, I'd be looked after, and also that, again, coming back to that sense of doing something that mattered.
When you speak of the idea of growing up a little bit and the Navy maybe providing an environment in which that can happen, could you talk a little about maybe some of the most important lessons that military life taught you and what growing up in that space looked like?
I think growing up was about realizing that, teamwork is essential to any organization, really, and you've got to understand your colleagues and yourself in order to do it effectively. Everything comes down to good communication, teamwork, and actually, if you get that right, you are capable of doing much more than you think. And I think that realization, when you're in the middle of Dartmoor, as I was when I was at Officer Training College and, knee deep in mud, thinking I'm never going to walk the next 10 miles. But you do it because you're within a team that helps you and you encourage each other. And then you achieve it. You go, my God, I did that. And so you achieve more than you think you achieve with the help of not just your own determination, but of that of your team. And I think there's a lot of that in filmmaking. We could probably come back to that later, but, it's all about the teamwork and the communication, and that breaking out of my kind of little mini ivory tower being a student was about realizing that understanding other people, getting to know other people and their limitations, as well as what they can bring, their talents, if you like, was an important lesson that the Navy helped me to develop, I think.
Okay. And yes, we will come back to it later. As you were speaking there, it made me think of that phrase I'm sure most people who have been on a set have heard, which is the idea of being in the trenches. So there obviously is a thread that helps that metaphor work.
Very much.
And what was the most difficult part of being in the Navy or the Navy training, or the most difficult lesson you had to learn or challenge you faced?
There are a few things, actually. I think a bit like filmmaking, the Navy training and some of the jobs I did involved very long hours. So it was about making sure that you had the stamina to do them and do them over and over and over and over on things that though really count, people's lives, really. And very early on in my career, I realized that you had to be really resilient to get through. There were moments when you kind of thought, my goodness me, this is something different. But yes, I think overall it was resilience and that kind of development of stamina that the Navy taught me was so important to doing a job effectively when it really counted. And that is when people's lives are at stake.
Very high stakes and being able to perform under intense pressure then.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And it's about looking after your shipmates, you know. It's about being aware that you have a responsibility for the people in your team, and then you report upwards to the people above you to make sure that, you know, everybody is singing from the same hymn sheet. It was a very important time for me in my learning curve as a human being, I suppose.
When you talk about resiliency, I think obviously in a very different context, but it's something that anyone working in the film and television industry also needs to be resilient in a different way. When you were in the Navy and developing that, did that come natural to you? Or was it something that you built over time?
I think resilience is a really broad thing. I don't really want to compartmentalize it or deconstruct it here, but I know that as a kid growing up in South Wales and going to a pretty average comprehensive school in the valleys, I developed my own level of resilience there in order to, because I had an ambition in life. I wanted to go to university, and not many people from my school went to university. So there was an inbuilt resilience that I wanted to get on in life, I suppose, and that was encouraged by my parents, you know, and I have to thank them for that. They were always, you know, my champions, if you like. But there's, you know, there's physical resilience, there's mental resilience, there's resilience with a team, there's solitary resilience. There are all these various different types, I think, that you have to draw upon in life. And there are some times when you're not resilient, and you've got to learn that that's okay, and you give yourself that moment, because we're not all superhuman. So that, I think, is an important lesson as well. One of the things I say recently, and I don't get much of it, but when I do take it, I say to myself, rest is productive, because I'm a bit of a workaholic. So that's resilience in another way, isn't it? It's allowing yourself to have that time to not be resilient, not be, you know, the leader that you have to be, you know, in my job, that you do actually, you can allow yourself time off resilience, and you can have a bit of downtime. Equally as important. It's about balancing your life, isn't it?
100%. And I think they're all really important distinctions. So thank you for pointing them out. And in terms of rest, we don't need to deconstruct rest or sleep. But if you look at research on sleep, it's so vital and it's so important. I was listening to some people talk about elite athletes, and oftentimes one of the big differences between their typical performance being brilliant and maybe just a one-off optimal performance is the ones who are consistent, are maniacal about sleep and rest and recovery.
Absolutely. And I think on a shoot, a long shoot like Shetland is, it's basically an 18-week shoot. It's a 19-week shoot with a 1-week break halfway through. And we work all hours, we work split days, you know, we're on clawbacks. There's a whole range of different things in there. Huge challenges with weather conditions up in Shetland. Sleep is king. And the discipline of switching off, having that half hour or an hour, if you can manage it, to unwind and go to bed early enough to get up in the morning, to feel that you can, you know, you've got another day ahead of you when you can do your best. That's a challenge.
Big time. And it can be hard to switch off, and it does take, like anything, practice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm a big fan of, well, I say I'm a big fan. I try and meditate. You know, and that can give me a little bit of that kind of brain space, if you like, where my brain is still chattering away 19 to the dozen, but there must be moments in that where different pathways in my brain are doing something interesting.
Definitely. I'm the same. I try and have a practice, but it can be difficult to do
Can
it.
be difficult. Yeah. Yeah. It's like, let's crack on and meditate. That's just not the right, but that's the kind of person I am, right? Okay, meditation time, right? I try really hard, right, to switch off 5 minutes, but I don't do daily practice, but there are occasions where I will allow myself to do it, and I'll just tuck myself away for 5 minutes. I'll go and sit in my car at lunchtime, 5 minutes, just to kind of breathe. And it actually refocuses me, and it gets me back again with my never-ending list of things to do.
Yeah. I think that decompression, even for those 5 minutes, though, is so important.
Oh, yeah, very much so. Very much so.
What prompted your career change then, moving from the Navy into theatre and television?
When I was in the Navy, there was a defence review called Options for Change. And a part of that was a lot of jobs that I was interested in doing within the Navy were being civilianized as part of cutbacks, defence cutbacks. And so a lot of the, if you like, my raison d'etre for being there was disappearing. And that combined with almost a political and personal shift in myself to, I suppose, live a broader life and have greater freedom of expression. So I decided to leave the Navy and do a PhD, actually. So I didn't go into television immediately. I went and did a PhD in environmental security, and I was based at the Peace Studies Department at the University of Bradford, an incredible place. They really supported me to do this very interesting work on the deployment of military resources on environmental tasks in a proactive way. So a constructive use of the military rather than a destructive one. And I presented my findings to NATO. And alongside that, I got really involved in a very active theatre group called Theatre in the Mill, which is a brilliant small-scale theatre attached to the University at Bradford. And I did a lot of work there, writing and directing plays, new work. And really, my creative juices started going. And I thought, maybe I don't want to be a lecturer anymore. Maybe I want to be a storyteller. But I didn't know what form that was going to take. I went to the Sheffield International Documentary Festival, and it's there that the penny dropped. And I thought, actually, you know what? I can be a storyteller. I can use my research skills from doing my PhD, and I can tell stories, whether they're drama or documentary. And the documentary train track opened up for me first. So that's the one I followed at Yorkshire Television initially, doing shows like Holidays from Hell. I was an undercover reporter in Europe, reporting from awful hotels that served sprouts for breakfast and all sorts. And it taught me the art of storytelling and filming it. I got into the edit quite early on as an assistant producer, and ended up then producing and directing my own documentaries for various broadcasters. First films I made were on the Battle of Jutland and the Battle of Waterloo, which involved a high degree of dramatic reconstruction alongside working with scientists on original research about those battles. So it's really interesting films to make.
There's so much stuff there I would love to just touch on. First and foremost, I just want to go back to presenting your findings to NATO. And I'm curious, when you then found Theatre of the Mill and you were beginning to tell stories, at any point did you think about, obviously your findings are data-based, but in presenting that information, were you beginning to formulate the telling of stories in terms of how you were presenting at that stage, or was that nowhere near kind of the forefront of your mind?
I think my PhD was one long story, one long, dense, factual story, a unique piece of research. And I think at the time I kept the factual storytelling, i.e. my PhD, quite separate from the fun thing, which was going to the Theatre in the Mill and acting, directing and writing plays, because I needed that, that release in my life, I suppose. And doing a PhD is a very solitary existence, whereas going to the Theatre in the Mill and hanging out with some really talented folk who like to create theatre was much more community-based and communal experience all round. So I learned from other people, and it was a hell of a lot of fun. It was really good fun. And, I met a lot of talented folk there who became professionals in theatre. We did this amazing project where we went to the Taganka Theatre in Moscow and performed an adaptation, very physical piece of theatre of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And then we funded an all-male company in Moscow to come to Bradford and perform Romeo and Juliet, an all-male Romeo and Juliet in Russian. So that was immensely exciting. and a great hobby at the time. It was a hobby that became something more real because I ended up working professionally. I was an actor for a while in a small theatre and education company. We did a play about heroin addiction, and I played the mother of a heroin addict. 69 performances made me realise that I didn't want to be an actor. And then I assistant directed a pantomime, a professional pantomime at Wakefield Theatre Royal. So I was dabbling in all sorts of things at that point, I think working out my next move. And when I went to the Sheffield Documentary Festival, I thought, actually, do you know what? This is really exciting. This is where I want to be right now, which is making documentary films. In fact, the first two films I researched were incredibly important, I felt, to the political conversations at the time. One was about cigarette smuggling and the impact of that. And the other was about the link between hepatitis C and haemophilia. That was, again, I felt I was coming back to what I said about the Navy, doing something that mattered.
When you were younger, was theatre or television something that excited you when you were in school, that you had previously thought about dabbling in, or was this something that just came because Theatre in the Mill was there and you balanced the maybe more isolated PhD life with this sense of community that you found there?
In terms of theatre, I was exposed to theatre from a very early age because my mum was an excellent actress on the amateur circuit in South Wales. And she was very much somebody that I looked up to in terms of the level of performance that she would give in the plays that she was in. I was just like bowled over. But I didn't have the confidence to do it myself then. And in terms of television, yeah, I mean, I was always fascinated by it, but it felt so out of reach, given my own family history. Nobody works in the business. I'm from a small village in South Wales, it's not something that people aspire to, really. It feels really out of reach. It's something that people in London do.
Yeah.
Of course, things have changed now, and and very rightly so. It's a very regional, people in the regions are embraced. And, it's really important that television is made all over the country and different voices are involved, but not when I was a kid.
So you found your way to documentary, and that filled, I guess, a personal value or ambition to do something that mattered. It seems like, and I'm drawing an assumption here, correct me if I'm wrong, that there was a lot of skills that you learned in the Navy that were transferable. And I was wondering, what were the working practices that you brought from the Navy to this new career that were the most transferable, the most impactful, and helped you kind of kickstart this part of your career?
There are lots of parallels, I think, between Navy life and making television. I think that teamwork is one of the most important things, as is leadership. As a director and a producer, you have to lead your team and you have to communicate what you want in a clear, concise and friendly yet firm way. And I think being an officer in the Navy, I very much did that, and that became second nature to me. There's also kind of parallels, if you like. Daily orders in the Navy tells you what you should be doing, who should be doing it and when, as does a call sheet, really. You have to be in a certain place at a certain time, and there's a breakdown. Everybody has their specific role on set. On a ship, everybody has their specific department they're working in, and everybody has a common objective. So there are huge parallels between the two. Most importantly, you have to be on time, and you can't be late. You have to be a really good timekeeper. But everybody has a specific role to play, to time, to budget. And so, yeah, there are lots of parallels there.
I would love to ask you about communication. It's come up a couple of times, and I think communication can be a challenge in that people have different... I'm really fascinated by language because we associate maybe slightly different meanings with different words. And I would love to get a sense of, when you were in the Navy and you're developing that skill of communication to ensure that people know exactly what is needed and what's required. I guess the question is, what were the challenges or you may not be able to talk about communication mistakes, but I think for myself personally, sometimes you may ask for something and you're not quite getting it, and you have to go and reflect and look at yourself first and foremost, go, well, how could I have communicated better? And I was wondering if you have had similar experiences and how you went about building your communication skills to the point that they are at now, if that makes any sense.
Yes. For me, the most important thing about communication is clarity. Might sound really obvious, but be very, very direct in what you're communicating. Keep it simple. Don't waffle. Just go, I would like X, Y, and Z by A, B, and C. What do you think? Listen, take on board the feedback, adjust your plan accordingly, and then deliver a new, clear set of objectives. It's almost as simple as that. But it took me a while to learn the balance between being really brief and concise, listening and adjusting. And that's, I think, now what I do on a daily basis. And I've learned the skill of doing that. And I hope my team, if they were sitting behind me, would go, yeah, she does that. Yeah. Maybe not all the time. When she's tired, she might not, but most of the time she does.
I love it.
And that's what I appreciate from my team as well. I often find I'm listening and I'm trying to pick out what the relevant bits are. And then I will say back to that person, like, I think this is what you're after. And I will go X, Y, and Z. And they go, oh, yeah, that's it. Oh, but you might have missed this out. Okay, great. So now we have a plan. But I think it's all about clarity, listening, and adjusting.
Love all of it. And I really like the distinction or the importance of the listening side of that. And that's a two-way street for both people engaged in that communication. It isn't singular, that you have to listen, and you probably have to do a little bit of work maybe to interpret exactly what someone is saying.
Well, I'm not a dictator. I'm a leader. And that's the difference. If you're a good leader, you have a plan, you listen to your team, you adjust your plan, and then onward you go. And that is a continuous process. And I like to surround myself with really lovely, talented people. That is one of the most important jobs I do as a producer, is bring the best people together for the job. And that is an absolute pleasure. It's also very hard work because I do meet a lot of people a lot of the time, because I'm very particular about who I like to work with.
Yeah.
I'm also very loyal. So if there's a team member that I like to work with, I'll invite them back. Because you have a degree of understanding then as well. So yeah, it's a lot of different things, but I do think you have to be a really good listener.
You mentioned leadership a couple of times, so I would love to ask you, in your own words, for anyone who maybe isn't familiar with exactly what a producer does, how do you describe your job as a producer in television?
I think a producer is at the heart of everything on a show. You realize the creative vision of the writer. You recruit the best people to tell the story. You manage the process throughout, to time and to budget. And you enable that script to be the best it can possibly be. So in a nutshell, you're a creative enabler, I would say. But you are at the heart of everything, and I think you need to be.
I love it. Creative enabler. You gave us that lovely description, I guess, of what makes good communication. I was wondering if you could maybe share your top 3 leadership tips or some leadership principles that you endeavor to practice daily.
Do the work, no shortcuts. I think you have to know what you're talking about. In my job, you need to know the scripts inside out. You need to know the demands on your team. You need to know the budget and where you can spend the money and where you can't spend quite as much money. Communication, I've gone on about this, but that's key. Cast, crew, but also remember your executive producers. As a producer, you manage as much upwards as you do downwards. And that is really, really important. They don't need to know the minutiae, but they certainly need to know the main challenges and the way in which, they can help you. And for me, that's briefing them properly so I get the decisions that I need from them in order to move things forward. Might be a key piece of casting, for instance. And I would say, look after yourself. That's a really important thing. Coming back to the meditation and I have a physical resilience stretch on our call sheet every day. I really believe that, healthy mind, healthy body and all that. So we try and help inject that balance and remind folk to move, even if it's just doing little, twisting your wrists or raising your ankles off the floor when you're on set. That for me is possibly the most challenging bit, is looking after myself and remembering to do that. I'm trying to get better at that bit.
I love the lead up and down the chain of command as well. Feels like a really important lesson that could occasionally be missed.
And within that, it's knowing what they need to know and what they don't need to know. So, like I said, leave out the minutiae. That's up to you and your team to figure out. But know what are the things that the execs really do need to know. And lean on them, get their advice, or offer them your thoughts on what the solution might be, and then get them to sign off. Try and make things as easy for them as possible because they don't have much time, because they're across multiple projects.
Yeah.
So always aware of that as well.
In those instances, would you advocate for, when you do encounter challenges, bringing a solution to the table in those situations as well, not just going with the challenge or the obstacle or the problem going?
Absolutely. Most of the time I offer, some solutions. So it's not just, this is the problem. It's, this is the problem. This is what I'm going to suggest. These are the options. What do you think? This will cost you more. This will cost you less. This will involve more time. This will involve less time. Again, it's that simplification and that clarity, trying to really get to the heart of what the issue is quite quickly, because we don't have time to mull it over for days. I'm a serial decision maker, and I like to think that some decisions take longer. Of course they do. On a day-to-day basis, you're constantly making decisions.
When you moved into, if we were to stick with documentary for the time being, what were the knowledge gaps that you had to bridge, even in terms of upskilling your technical knowledge and learning the process maybe of cameras, editing, framing, all that type of stuff? What was that process like for you?
When I first got into documentaries, it was more of a gradual rise. I mean, I worked in documentaries for 20 years before I moved into drama. So I joined as a researcher, as assistant researcher, and worked my way up to assistant producer, director, series producer. Worked on big shows like I directed Robson Green Extreme Fishing, a massive series for Discovery called How the Universe Works, which was tremendous fun. So that gradual, because it was over a 20-year period, you've got that opportunity to learn a lot over that length of time. And it was a slow evolving process. Every job gave me the opportunity to learn new stuff. By the end of that, I was doing, multi-camera shoots up to 17 cameras, air-to-air filming. I filmed a presenter out of a Black Hawk with Apache helicopters firing missiles behind them. It was awesome, filmed in Alaska, in the jungle with Robson Green and Extreme Fishing. The life experiences, I'm a bit of an experience junkie, as you could probably tell, were incredible. And I'm hugely grateful for every single one of them. When I moved into drama, that learning process was really squeezed. I had some exposure to drama before, because back in 2005, I was associate producer on a film about the building of the Titanic, which was a scripted drama. And I helped develop that script with our writer. And so I was exposed at that point to the scale of drama. And then when I revisited it and went, okay, I'm going to step up to be a high-end drama producer back in 2016 with the support of Screen Skills, I got amazing training through this incredible program, which basically condensed probably what I should have learned over 20 years into a couple of years. And that involved going to the NFTS for a producer's course, master classes with key professionals, going to the Edinburgh Television Festival, and it culminating in a placement as a co-producer on Les Miserables, which was a Netflix BBC co-production for Lookout Point, written by Andrew Davis and starring Dominic West and David Oyelowo and Olivia Colman. So yes, going from a standing start to that level within 18 months, I carried a little notebook with me everywhere, and I wasn't afraid to ask the daft questions because that's what I could do. And it well equipped me for what was to come. I knew pieces of it already, but putting it all together on that scale was new to me.
It sounds like you were having so much fun as a documentary director, and making incredible work. What was it that drew you to producing high-end television as opposed to maybe choosing the path of a director in that world?
I'm still a bit torn, if I'm honest. I do quite a lot of directing on the show. I pick up second unit, and I do the drone directing on Shetland. I directed a cliff jump for season 8 of Shetland, all sorts of bits and bobs. And I still see myself as a director, but I love the producing role as well. So it is an odd position to be in that you've got to make a choice in drama quite a lot of the time. Some don't, they produce and direct. But as a producer, I see the project through right from the start to the finish. I bring this amazing team of individuals together to make it. And we create the magic together. And there's something very, very satisfying about that. But the bottom line is I still see myself as a storyteller. I would go back and direct again if the right job came along. And I'm developing a few ideas myself, and some of them are documentary features. So I don't see this as a one-way ticket. I think in life you've got to kind of just maybe sometimes throw things a bit in the air and see what speaks to you in your heart.
I think it's great that you still get to flex that muscle as well.
My background as a producer is possibly different to most in that I'm not a line producer. I'm a creative producer. I'm a writer-producer, a director-producer. So I very much see things through the director's eyes, but I've got a very strong, if you like, sensible gene that actually says that's going to cost us too much. But I tell you what, we could do it this way, and you'll get the same impact on screen, or similar, and we can afford that because, you know, of our level of funding for the Shetland. So I'm always pushing for the maximum amount of money on screen, the highest production value we can afford, supporting my directors 110%, and understanding where they're coming from. And I enjoy meeting, I like working with directors that excite me. I think, yeah, their creative vision, wow, that's terrific. And I learn from them. That's a really interesting coverage there. I hadn't thought of that. That's great. I find that exciting, you know?
Yeah.
And when I read a script, I see it in shots. So I probably read it like a director. I don't see it and go, oh gosh, that's going to cost too much. I mean, I do a little bit. I think I do that alongside. If I'm honest, it's going to cost that much. That's special effects, that's visual effects, that's a stunt. Right, okay. That's in Shetland, that's going to cost more money because we're going to have to transport them up there, you know, that. But alongside that, it's very much a creative pull of, we could do that with that scene and it's going to look amazing. And then listen to what, I'm not prescriptive to the director, I listen to them.
There's something I do think is really exciting about that. When you see, I've had it with work where you've maybe read something and someone else is making it, and the image you have in your head versus what someone else delivers can be so revitalizing and refreshing because it isn't what you saw, and you get to see how someone else's mind works and their interpretation. It's an exciting space to live in. If we were to talk then about your move into high-end television and producing, could you talk about your time on Les Mis, share whatever you're able to share, and what that process was like then off the back of the screen skills? Would we call it a course or a placement?
Yeah, it was both really. Screen Skills ran in 2016 a co-producer step-up program. It felt like the right time for me. At the time I was series producing a show for Sky called Prison First and Last 24 Hours. It's the second season we've been recommissioned. A second season is always nice to do because you feel that you know what you're doing. So in my spare time, I joined a group called the Tron 100, a group of 100 creatives in Scotland that were brought together to produce, direct and write new work. And I wrote a play. I workshopped at the Tron Theatre with professional actors. And so the drama side of me was starting up anyway. And a member of my team on prisons came to me and said, "Hey Lou, there's this scheme going. You should apply for this. You like your drama stuff." And I looked at it and it was almost like it'd been made for me. So I thought, right, let's apply for this, and got on it. So the drama side of my interests were already being rekindled in theatre at the same time as I applied for the screen skills. And that started with meeting all the other really talented folk on the course. A lot of people had much more, obviously, experience in drama than I had. I was the only documentary person there, as I mentioned. But they all brought something different and they all wanted to move up in drama. We did a course at the NFTS. The culmination of it all was your placement. And I met Chris Carey, who was the producer of Les Miserables. And I felt that what he saw in me was something that he had, which was he had a documentary background as well. I told him what I feel, and I still feel passionately about every day, is the power and importance of authenticity. And we talked a lot about that in terms of the Battle of Waterloo. I didn't realise that the Battle of Waterloo is what opens Les Mis. I had obviously seen the script. I didn't know he was doing it. So the offer came out of the blue, and I was over the moon. So I accepted his offer, and the next 18 months pretty much worked full time on Les Mis. And that involved 6 months in Brussels where we were filming. I ended up doing a lot of second unit directing, and that wasn't kind of ticking clocks and stuff like that. I directed some quite major sequences. They learned very quickly to trust me. The schedule was just too much for the main director, Tom Shanklin, to take on himself. So one of the biggest scenes I had the privilege of directing was a riot scene in a square in Brussels that involved well over 100 extras and about 6 or 7 main cast. And it was the funeral of a general and a riot and soldiers on horseback. And we had a steady cam and a drone and green screen. And yeah, it's a pretty impressive. When you put all that together, I was really proud of it. It was great. It was a riot. It was properly brutal. I also had the privilege of directing Davy Oyelowo and Olivia Colman on smaller scenes, and Dominic West, and I hadn't really done much drama directing at that point. I'd done dramatic reconstruction, a lot of it in documentaries. So yeah, it was great. I would do my storyboards, present them to Tom, talk about my camera plan, and away I went. They were really trusting of me, and I was very grateful for that opportunity.
It's amazing. And what a brilliant way to go and really begin your career in drama. That's spectacular. I was going to ask you about the learning curve then moving into that world and learning how to produce high-end television. Would I be right in thinking that the NFTS part of the program was classroom based, and how long did that last? How much of a crash course was that part of the program?
It was a 1-week course. It was like a production management course run by a line producer. So it was all the sensible side of the business, all the legals, business affairs, movie magic, budget and scheduling. Yes, a totally different area to what I was used to in documentaries. And what I feel is, very important grounding for a producer. You need to know all this stuff. Ultimately, of course, on Shetland, I work alongside a line producer who is really involved in that stuff, in line producing and presenting the budget. But having the grounding and the understanding of that, which I was also exposed to on Les Miserables, obviously on a very big scale, it was a big budget production, was really important. It was a great grounding, but yes, it was a bit of a crash course, which I then learnt the basics on that and then developed that with the line producer of Les Mis, who was very generous with her time. And I would sit down with her and go through the budget and learn to understand all the different departments, the lines, how the cost reporting works. Yeah, it was crucial stuff.
There's so much value in classroom learning, but I always wonder then how people find the applicability of the classroom to the real life scenario when you are actually thrown into the midst of something as large as what you were thrown into.
I think the key difference was it was a period drama on a massive scale with a huge level of visual effects. Whereas in the classroom, I think we used Ab Fab the movie as our template. So it was a very different genre. Obviously comparing a movie to a massive 6-part series as well, different kind of narrative arc. But the basics I learned on that course. So it wasn't all kind of a mystery to me when I turned up at Les Mis. It really did give me a good grounding. And in terms of the legal and business affairs and cans, learning about cast device notes and all of that kind of thing. Yeah, it was a good wee course for me who knew virtually very little, really. I mean, I might have touched upon it now and again with key talent, presenters, contracts in documentary, because I'd worked with key talent like Robson Green and Ross Kemp, but most of the time that was handled strictly by business affairs in documentaries, and as a producer in drama, you're more involved in that side of things, particularly, with your cast and your heads of department.
Earlier on, you mentioned that you had a notebook with you all the time and you weren't afraid to ask, I think what you said was the daft questions. And over the course of working on Les Mis, this is probably a very broad question and difficult to really distill because it was such a long period of time that you were working on the show. But I have 2 questions, actually. One is, what were the core takeaways or the key learnings that you walked away from that experience with? My second question was going to be about the trust that you were able to build and how quickly you were able to build that to get to even direct those second unit scenes in this big riot. And I think your body of work probably spoke for itself and proved you were capable. But I was curious because trust is something that continually comes up on the podcast. I don't think I've done an episode where it isn't mentioned. And it's such an important part of what we do because it's such a collaborative medium we work in. And I was curious about, when you reflect on it, were there things you did that build trust, or how do you go about ensuring that there is real trust in your teams now?
On Les Mis, I think I gained people's trust by being genuinely interested in what they were doing and asking questions and learning quickly what the demands were on their particular team and department. That was combined with quite a lot of research I did to bottom out the authenticity of various moments that were important to us in the scripts. The Battle of Waterloo being one of them. The the uniform that the soldiers were wearing at the battle. The look of the streets during the time when cholera was a massive issue at the time. What that look would be. So I was working across the art department, costume, makeup, and by taking an interest in them and genuinely understanding the way in which those teams work, while also offering them research, I think they understood that that I had something to bring them as well as something to learn. And so there was this two-way relationship. And then I started to direct bits and bobs. I directed the rebellion for the moment on the streets when it's the rebels versus the soldiers. I was directing on the soldiers' side. I also knew a fair bit about military drill because I directed a film about the Battle of Waterloo, and I'd done some research on that. So I think I'm also a bit older you know, so people knew that I already had 20 years experience in TV, but not especially in this level of drama. So maybe I asked the right questions, as well as maybe the daft ones. They were the daft right questions that I asked. Understanding how all the bits come together, and on that scale, costume, makeup, visual effects, special effects, stunts, you know, in post-production, music, working with a composer, the editor.
It strikes me from what you're saying that it all ultimately came from a place of real, genuine interest.
Genuine interest and respect for what they do to such a high level, under so much pressure. Absolute, total respect for each and every one of them. And then having the generosity of spirit to share their knowledge with me and write it in my little book, which I got known for.
I love it.
I've still got them. I still look at them.
I know we're generally moving away from paper, and I try and use an iPad more, even for note taking, but there's still something about just a pen and paper and a little notepad, so valuable.
So this is my little notebook. So it fits in my pocket. It's not anything that I have to carry. It just fits in any pocket I've got. And it's always hardback, and it always has a bit of elastic around the front, so the pages aren't flapping open.
I love it. So that is the current Shetland notebook?
This is the current Shetland notebook.
Okay.
And at the back, I have, at the back of the notebook, I keep my rolling list of things to do. At the front of the notebook is ideas and big picture stuff.
When you think of the Les Mis notebook, if I was to go back, if you haven't an answer or a thought, I was curious what the headline lessons were in that notebook that you took away from that show. And that may be very difficult to answer, because I'm sure there was endless lessons and endless learning.
It's a really tricky one to answer. You know, many times we have to turn our plan really quickly for a whole bunch of different reasons. And we have to have that degree of flexibility and not to be frightened of it. When we know that we have to change, just do it. Be decisive and go for it. And there were a few moments on Les Mis when the plan had to change at very short notice on a considerable scale, whether it was weather related or a location falling through, or cast being ill, all the usual reasons that, you know, folks who are in the business will know about. But when you're dealing on such a big scale, on a lot of the days we had on Les Mis, there were a lot of essays in, dailies and so on. So it's right. Okay, we're changing, work it through and do it as efficiently and quickly as possible, and not to be frightened of it. And the same is true this season on Shetland. Every season on Shetland, we have different challenges, and you have to work the problem, and you have to be, have that flexibility and work it through and come out the other side. And that can take an hour, or it can take weeks to work through. It depends on what the issue is.
That might bring us quite nicely, actually, to Shetland. And you started on the show in season 6, which, if I'm not mistaken, was shot during COVID. COVID probably wasn't here when you booked that gig and moved on to produce. And that seems like, obviously, it upended the entire world. Must have been a massive challenge coming into the show to navigate. We don't need to necessarily talk about COVID specifically. It just seemed like a segue based on what we're talking about, and the adaptability you have to have and the flexibility you have to be able to exhibit. But when you move on to a show like that, how do you begin to navigate it in terms of the show has an audience? There's a grammar, there's a style and tone and an expectation.
I was already a fan of Shetland before I produced it. So I respected the show. I enjoyed it as a viewer. I loved the storytelling, and I was really curious about the place. So the first thing I did, even before my interview with my exec producer, was kind of watch the whole series twice over, once for fun and once making notes. So I knew it inside out, knew everything that was done to date. And then I thought about what I would bring to the show that could just ever so slightly turn the dial up on it. I felt that there could be more thriller beats, that we could really lean into the edginess a bit more, that we could take more epic Shetland coverage and really showcase Shetland as a character. The show was already doing this, but I just wanted what I saw was a tweak, a dial turn, leaning more into that. So I spoke to the director of Block One about this dial turn, and we brainstormed ideas, and then he really ran with it with his DOP. And I feel that we also, in addition to that, once we had the filming in the bag, we then built a different soundscape and worked with the composer to slightly tweak the score so that, again, leaning into the edginess a bit more. And I think that in itself created a slightly different Shetland. So I put my little footprint on it, if you like. But by still having a huge amount of respect for what was already a really well-made show. But anybody that comes into a show wants to do their thing. But I also want to respect what had been done before. Shetland has a massive following, both nationally and internationally, and there's no need to change it. There was just the opportunity to lean into certain areas a bit more and create something different. And also by season 7, we ran season 6 and 7 back to back. We made them in a year, which was just too much, really, if I'm honest. It was a massive undertaking, but we did that because of COVID. Because we'd been stood down the previous year. We lost a whole year's work because of COVID. So we then squeezed, it was a double commission, so we squeezed both seasons into a year. By season 7, I wanted there to be orchestral music in the show. So we managed to work the budget so that each block of 3 episodes has a certain amount of orchestral cues. So we could, again, even more lean into the epicness with big music numbers to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up in the mix, basically. And that has stuck with the show ever since. So little by little, you know, you put your mark while also respecting what's gone before.
I love it. I think the image or the term you used there, just turning that dial up ever so slightly, because I think it's a very challenging thing to do to come into a show that is as established and still find a way to elevate in the right kind of way and not try to change anything that the show already is. There's a balance.
Yeah, I mean, that was really kind of what I went with in season 6 and 7. And then, of course, I was invited back to produce season 8, which involved an even bigger change. And that was obviously bringing Ashley Jensen in to be alongside Alison O'Donnell. So we created Calder and Tosh. So again, having 2 really strong female characters at the heart of the show, having the opportunity to slightly tonally shift the show, but again, not too much, but just enough to give it a different feel again. A reinvention is what the BBC wanted. So that gave me and my team the opportunity to move things and shift things in a slightly different way again. And here we are now making season 9 and next year season 10. So on we go.
Brilliant. And that's such an exciting space then to play in as well, where you do have a slightly bigger shift and tonal shift that you can play in. Shetland may be a good way of framing this next question, and it is, in your day-to-day, what are the biggest challenges or most common challenges that you face as a producer?
I think any producer listening to this would agree that it's balancing the script and schedule, balancing creative and budget, money. And you come across that every day, pretty much. Making the day work. Season on season, Shetland gets more and more ambitious. And we've slightly increased the amount of filming time we have over the years, but it's always tight. And we're constantly pushing the envelope in terms of making the high-end nature of Shetland count. It's a 2-camera shoot. we don't cross shoot. We have very high production values. Last season, we used anamorphic lenses on the London material and spherical lenses for the Shetland material for lots of different reasons. I mean, we're constantly pushing the envelope in terms of making it the best it possibly can be. But then within me, it's like, gosh, are we going to make the day? Can this really work? It's not going to be Ben-Hur in the morning, Benny Hill in the afternoon. Are we going to really get what we want out of these scenes? And again, that comes down to trusting your director and DOP and first to make the day, talking to them about the schedule in advance, absolutely making sure that it's going to work, asking them more than once, are you sure? Making the changes if you need to make them. But obviously everything has to be in line with the cast that you've booked and what you've committed to weeks-wise for your cast. You can't be changing your schedule too much because it will involve extra cast booking. So it's this massive balancing act, really, every day.
On that, you mentioned something earlier. I was going to maybe ask you about what are some of the solutions then that exist in terms of balancing creative and budget. Earlier, you mentioned the idea of maybe someone saying, oh, I would love to do this. And you may have the ability to go, well, that specifically will cost us too much, but there is a way of doing it here that will have the same impact, but it isn't that super expensive thing. So could this work? I was curious, could you talk about some of those other solutions maybe that when you do face problems like that, would you go back to the page and try and maybe make amends there and say, well, this 4-page chase doesn't work, but we can do a version of it over a page or whatever the case may be?
Absolutely. I mean, there are a whole range of solutions that you can look at. One is to go back to scripts and say, okay, so I'd sit down with the exec and the script exec, script editor, and talk in detail about that scene and what the challenges are for us time-wise. Can they cut 4/8 page? Can they cut a page? We've got too many strips this day. This is a 15-strip day. It really needs to be a 9-strip day. What can go? Is there any duplication? We got to be really careful about cutting material in a complex crime drama like Shetland, because there's, particularly in studio where we have our HQ set and our instant room, because there's a lot of procedural information there. So cutting scripts is not always the answer. And I'm constantly, talking to the script supervisor, what is our estimated running time now? So we balance that with, maybe me not going to scripts because we are on time or we're only 3 minutes over. And actually we need those 3 minutes in the edit to play with. So another solution might be building a micro set in studio. So rather than filming something in a back alley in Shetland, we will create a section of that back alley in a micro set in studio and shoot it back at home, because that saves us very expensive Shetland shooting time. We've done that a few times. We've cheated Shetland in a corner studio. For me, it's a balancing act between actually what we do decide to shoot in Shetland, which is mainly exterior material. We do shoot some material in Shetland because of either there might be massive picture windows in a particular location, so you can see the exterior. So
it strikes me as, and in my own experience, it's an ongoing negotiation of all of these things.
There is never one answer. There might be, but in my experience, you're always balancing. There are scenes in a day that really matter. And there are scenes in a day that you think, okay, every scene matters, but these are maybe ones that we can have simpler coverage on in order to save time. And these are the ones we want to invest our coverage in. And any first would schedule those before lunch. Let's get the real meaty scene done first up. And let's maybe look at maybe some cuts, or let's look at where we are shooting that. Let's look at cutting down the number of unit moves in a day when we're losing filmic time. That's the one thing that it's not a pet hate of mine, because it's obviously necessary, but when we have so many locations in the schedule, we have to move the unit. And that's not an easy thing to do in the middle of the day. And you know that the clock is ticking.
Yeah.
You're losing filming time. But sometimes it's necessary.
What is your favorite part of your job?
It's really difficult to pinpoint. the most favourite part of producing Shetland, or producing any script, any series really. I think for me, it's gathering a group of talented people together to create magic. And that magic being the manifestation that was once in the writer's head, that then is on the page, that then becomes reality in a relatively short space of time. And that is a very special and precious thing to do. Making it real.
That's a great answer. What is your least favorite part of the job? Not specific to Shetland now, just in general of being a producer.
Sometimes you face impossible situations and you have to battle to make them possible. And sometimes that battle is pretty hard and you might feel quite isolated as a producer in that battle. You have to be one step back as a producer. There has to be a figurehead, but sometimes it is quite a lonely place to be. Over the years, I've become okay with that because I have a different support network at home. I'm very lucky to have that. Yeah, it's sometimes it's the impossible battle, I suppose. But you have to remain optimistic. So you have an impossible battle. You have to remain optimistic that there is a solution, but at the time it might feel just too much. I guarantee that nearly every producer's been in that situation at some point. Maybe at 3 o'clock in the morning in the middle of the field in a howling gale and rain. And that's a whole other thing on Shetland, the weather. Oh my goodness me. It's challenging to say the least. Those situations aren't impossible. Sometimes it's quite easy to say, listen, guys, it's too dangerous to carry on at the moment, so we stop filming. And then an hour later, we start filming again when it's safe to do so, because people's safety is the key thing.
Okay.
I don't know whether that answers your question, but it's sometimes facing the impossible and feeling that there's a time lag between realizing, oh my goodness me, this is impossible, and coming up with a solution and feeling quite isolated in that moment. That is tricky.
I think it's a really good answer, and thank you for sharing. It's not the first time that a producer has mentioned that aspect of isolation that producers can face because you are trying to protect everyone else maybe from this thing, and in doing that, you're entirely on your own in trying to solve it. And the first time I heard it, it made total sense to me, but wasn't something I had thought of before. So I appreciate you sharing that aspect of it as well.
I'm glad I'm not the only one.
What is the worst career advice you have ever been given?
I went to a comprehensive school in the valleys in South Wales. And when I was at school, the girls in the class were taken off to one room and the boys in the class went off to another for careers advice. And the girls' careers advice was to become a nursery nurse or a nurse. And the boys' careers advice was to become a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. So the worst bit of career advice I've ever had is to become a nursery nurse. I think it's not what I wanted to do. I didn't feel it was fair. And I wrote a letter to my teacher to complain, as did other girls in the class. Yeah, I mean, I think that's in a nutshell. That's the one that springs to mind. Because since then, I've had the good fortune to follow my heart. And that has involved a lot of hard work. But I have realized what I wanted in my life. And that is, to tell stories in the best way I possibly can. In documentaries, in drama. And I'm now looking to the next chapter and I'm writing. So, I would love, my ambition now is to get something produced that I've actually written. That's next on the card. So onward the journey goes, if you like.
Brilliant. If you could go back in time as you are now and whisper something in young Louise's ear after she's been given that terrible advice where there's 2 possible avenues open to her, you could offer her a piece of advice about the career that she's going to find herself in. What would that be?
Keep going and enjoy the ride. Life has its ups and downs. I read a really good book when I made the decision to leave the Navy, and it was called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway by Susan Jeffers.
Good book.
Yeah, amazing book, which I still dip into. I would borrow her phrase, and it is feel the fear and do it anyway. life's ups and downs will come along the way. It's not, all the cliches in the book. It's not plain sailing, all of them, right? But in the end, everything's going to be all right.
Great advice. I'm always interested in failure. I think it is the foundation of success. And I think we learn more from when we fail than when we do succeed. I was going to ask if you have any stories you can share where you turned or experienced what felt like failure at that time into an opportunity for growth or something positive.
There've been jobs I've missed out on over the years, and at the time you're really gutted that you've missed out on that opportunity and you think you failed. But actually around the corner, there is always something else. So you've got to keep the faith. And, things are very difficult right now for a lot of people. A lot of my colleagues are at work. I feel very lucky to be in work and producing. And I hope they don't feel like they're failing. I think the industry is failing them. And there's a bigger picture at play here. But I've faced tricky situations, obstacles, and I may not always have made the right decisions, but I have made a decision, which then can play out in one way or another. And then I make a different decision, maybe that gets us back on track. And I think that's key. I think indecision is a failure.
I think everything you have said is important and does answer the question. I think, again, the language of failure can sometimes seem, maybe that's the wrong word to use. Maybe it is just setbacks that people have encountered as opposed to outright failure. Failure seems much bigger than these small things. But I think what you said about the industry at the moment and colleagues being out of work and how those moments can feel like failure for people personally, but flipping that, and it is not a personal failure, it is an industry failing people, is really important. So I just wanted to go back to that point.
Yeah, I think it's a sad loss that some people have had to leave the business as a result of the economic downturn and the lack of work. Ultimately, people have to earn a living. They've got to pay their mortgages. They have to support their families themselves. And it's a very serious situation we find ourselves in. And I just really hope that things are on the up. I've heard one person say to me, survive to 25. It's horrible, isn't it, when you think that it is about survival? A lot of people put a lot on the line to be in this business because it is a freelance, insecure world, which I struggle with over the years. I'm a person that likes to know what I'm doing when I'm doing it. And when you're out of work, sometimes so much of your identity is tied up with what you do that when you lose that, you go, gosh, who am I? And there's no money coming into my bank account. And what am I going to do? And that's happened to me on and off over the last 25 years, for sure. I'm not unusual in that regard. And I think a lot of people, that is what happens in our business. But for some who've been struggling for so long, I think that's a different level of stress and worry and anxiety. And it's something that I really hope that can change very, very soon.
Yes, I have also heard survive to 25. One or two people have actually mentioned it on the podcast, and it's so grim. But we are now mid-July, so we are inching ever closer to 25, which can only be a good thing if we're to believe what is being said. So I do think as well, even though you mentioned, you're not entirely on your own in that feeling of uncertainty when it occurs, I think it's still really important to say. So thank you for sharing that as well, because the more people, I think, realize that everyone in the industry has these moments and feels them, the safer this space of being in them, I think, begins to feel. So appreciate you sharing that aspect of that as well.
No worries. No worries.
What advice would you have for aspiring producers?
Get experience, both through training and being practical. Training is one thing, being in a classroom is one thing, but get out there and actually do it. Even if it's with a group of friends or through a college, make your short film, manage that budget, crew up, actually learn by doing. I think that's a key thing. So get out there, learn the process and do it. You won't get it right all the time, but you will learn from that and you won't make the same mistake twice, particularly if it costs you a lot of money. It is a tough business, so have a support network around you. Have your champions and your cheerleaders that encourage you to go and do it, to get out there and not to be frightened.
Feel the fear and do it anyway.
Yeah, for sure. And decide what sort of producer you want to be. There are all sorts of different producers. I'd like to say I'm a creative producer, a director producer. But there are producers with strong logistics backgrounds, budgetary backgrounds, locations backgrounds, first AD backgrounds. What sort of producer are you going to be? And bring those skills to the table and then work out where your weak points are and make sure that you've got all those covered as well. And that's something you can learn very early on, when you are first setting out. Try and get yourself a mentor who's more experienced, who can lead you through the earlier stages of your career as well.
Love the advice of trying to find a mentor. Would you encourage people to go out and work different jobs on sets if they can build that experience? I think the fact you were even performing in theatre, you had this really broad taste of what a lot of those jobs could be.
I think the best advice I could give for any producer is be a floor runner, be a base runner, learn how the mechanics work from the bottom up, be on set. Because if you're in an office with scripts, I know a lot of producers come up through the script editor route, and that's great too, because your understanding of story, of narrative, of character arcs, really all crucial stuff. But as soon as you can, get yourself on the set, make it real, so you understand the way in which a set works and what the limitations are and what, how people operate basically on set. So I think that can feed into your knowledge, because I've been at the sharp end for so long, albeit in documentaries. I knew how to schedule. I knew, leading a team, albeit a very much smaller one on documentaries, how long it takes to film something. How long does it take to shoot this scene? How many setups are there? Just learn the mechanics of the set. I think that'd be a great way for producers to start out, alongside maybe working with scripts or whatever department you're coming from, but just really know how a set works.
You mentioned Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway as a book that was impactful at a particular point in your life. Do you have any recommended reads or other resources that you would maybe advise people to check out?
I'd recommend Dr. Chatterjee's Feel Better, Live More podcast, which I think is a wonderful resource for self-care. And we all have to look after ourselves in this job. I subscribe to New Scientist. It's my little bit of light reading on the side. It's my escapism. I have a chair in the kitchen where I sit and read articles. I find it stimulates a different part of my brain and I enjoy that. So find out what else, what is it out there that you could, give yourself brain rest from. I like a lot of podcasts and I listen to a lot of them. And another one I like is Diary of a CEO, Stephen Bartlett. I don't tend to read much when I'm producing. I'm reading enough scripts, so the reading tends to fall away. So it might be a little bit of New Scientist and a little bit of a podcast with Dr. Chatterjee, and that's about all I'm up to, if I'm completely honest. And then in between, I would definitely deep dive into novels and other stuff.
Earlier, you mentioned particularly how identities can become so tied up with the work we do. So if the work isn't there, who am I becomes a thing. And I think it's so important, just in terms of New Scientists, having those interests that are also outside of the film and television world, even if it is books or playing a bit of music, whatever the case may be, super vital.
Yeah, it's all about trying to have a balanced life, and actually when you're in production, that's really difficult. It becomes all consuming and you kind of want it to be, because you want the show to be the best it can possibly be. But equally, you do need your rest moments. You do need to have a little bit of time out here and there, and crafting that and learning when that can be is a really important thing. Something that I really have only recently started to embark on, if I'm completely honest. And I've been in the business a long time, because I have just thrown myself into my work. And I think now, you just think, well, you got to look after yourself too. So it's about that balance and about being grown up about it. Because you know, if you look after yourself, you can then look after everybody else.
You are writing now, and that is something you would like to be doing next. I was wondering, can you talk to us about what is next? Obviously, you are on mid-production on Shetland season 9 at the moment. But are you able to share anything else that's coming up for Louise Say?
I'd love to have some time off to write. Whether or not that'll happen, well, we'll just have to see, to be honest. Shetland 10 is around the corner, and I love producing this show, but we'll just have to see what happens.